Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down something pretty specific. It's not just footage of me fighting at Revolution Rumble 2024 again, though it really is. It's of a particular fight where my opponent managed to counter my starting stance. Now, if you've watched my footage before, you probably know that I start in pretty much the same stance every single time. I fight with my right leg forward, my left leg back, with my hands down by my left hip, with my crossguard flat, and my thumb on top of the blade. A lot of people fence that way, but there is a very easy way that you can counter it, and it's by starting from a very particular position and by throwing a particular technique. But before I get into that, I have to kind of demonstrate what I mean when I talk about the disadvantages of this stance. And it has to do a little bit with biomechanics. So if I get myself into position here, the basic idea is something I've repeated before, but it's very simple. Your maximum reach is determined by the length of your shoulders. So if you reach both your arms out, this is your maximum reach. And like that, it's pretty normal and easy to understand. But if you start turning your shoulders, something weird happens. Your arms get longer, one of them gets longer and one of them gets shorter. But when you have your sword in your hands are tied together, which means they can't actually do this kind of pull cue motion. What it means is that when you start turning your shoulders, instead of one arm getting longer, it has to shorten itself up so that it can stay in the bind. And what happens is one arm is at max length and the other arm's kind of bent because it's stuck together. And this is going to come into play throughout these exchanges, but I wanted to bring it up because it's something that I think a lot of people don't realize when they talk about the differences between longsword fencing and more single-hand fencing. So for the first clip, we see a good demonstration of what I'm talking about in application. I am fencing with my right leg forward in a kind of left plow, but my opponent is fighting with their also right leg forward, but in a high Vom-Tog with their thumb on the schild. Now we're both standing in thumb grip, but we're both standing in a completely different stance that prioritizes different things. And the reason I brought up my little demonstration at the beginning is in part because of this first exchange demonstrates one of the advantages of starting in a plow or long point style position while in thumb grip. As you can see, I come forward, and as soon as my opponent starts throwing their dominant side cut, I simply thrust at their shoulders, which allows my crossguard to interfere with the path of the sword my opponent was trying to throw, and just kind of gets in the way. It blocks the hand shot and simultaneously thrusts. A great little exchange. However, one thing you want to pay attention to is the fact that in my stance, my right leg forward is well further forward than my opponent's, and as a result, my right shoulder is a little bit further forward than my left. And what that means, as you remember from the demonstration earlier, it means that my reach is limited by the reach of my left arm and not my right. And one thing that I think people don't necessarily consider is that it does mean that despite the fact that I am in a point forward stance, I actually technically have less reach than my opponent. And it's part of the reason why this particular exchange works, and as we'll see later, part of the reason why it sometimes fails. So in the next exchange, we see a bit of a demonstration of how this can go very wrong. My opponent has a similar sort of setup. They feint a cut instead of actually throwing it on their right side and then come around to the cut on the left. But if you want to imagine a theoretical scenario where I did the exact same thing as I did in the first clip, I could have simply tried to thrust my sword directly at my opponent's head, and maybe, because my crossguard was flat and horizontal, I would have been able to parry the right side of my hands the same as I parried the left side of my hands previously. But there is a key difference here that is going into the attack. Now, if you look at my opponent, you can see that despite the fact that we're both fencing with our right legs forward, at full extension, my opponent has completely lined up and made horizontal their hips. And what that means is that, if you know anything about human bodies, that hips tend to be always in line with the shoulders on top of them, which means that if your hips are even, your shoulders are even. And if your shoulders are even, going back to our demonstration at the beginning, it means your reach is at its maximum. However, if you look at my shoulders, they are not even, which means that there is a critical difference and problem of defense when you're talking about the stance that I am taking. And that is, despite the fact that I'm holding my crossguard in a horizontal position, and despite the fact that you might assume I would be able to defend my right side just as easily as my left side, that is actually not the reality. Because, if you remember the demonstration again, when you pull one shoulder back, the other one has to go with it. And given that my right shoulder is the one that is forward, it means that my left arm is the one that is bent. And what that means, also more importantly, is that when I throw my thrust from my left hip, it has to cross the center line in such a way that the cross guard is kind of sitting in front of my hand on the left side as it starts, and then in front of the right side of my hand as it ends. Now, this doesn't mean that thrusting directly into this attack would have failed, but it does mean that the combined efforts of my opponent having well spread out their hips, and the fact that they were clearly going for my hand and didn't really reach too far past their target, means that it's entirely possible that not only would my hands have been hit as my hands traveled from my bottom left to my kind of middle right, but also that I wouldn't have had the reach to reach my target and land in a proper thrust. So there's a bit of an advantage and disadvantage at play here. On the one hand, when it came from my left side, my opponent's right side, this particular kind of thrust into opposition worked absolutely amazingly. But when he threw the exact same technique on the opposite side of my body, the biomechanics in play came out to my disadvantage. And this becomes very important later on when we see some other demonstrations of, again, similar exhibitions of the exact same setup, but where the results were very different. Now, on this next clip, we see another real worst case scenario. We see the exact same setup as the first clip, only this time I don't even make it to my target. My opponent does successfully hit me in the hands, though you could maybe call it not very great quality, but what you do know for sure, and thanks to the angle of the camera, is that my point comes very, very close to my opponent's chest, but never really manages to bury or get any kind of bend. And the reason for that is, again, this reach problem. When you see how my body is positioned when I'm at my furthest reach, I'm extended over my feet, so I've put my shoulders very far forward to try to reach my target, but my left shoulder is still a little bit behind my right. And what that means, again, is that my reach has been shortened by, in what this case would have been the crucial couple of inches I would have needed to land my thrust. But another thing to take into consideration here is, as I mentioned earlier, the travel path that I go from my left plow to my full extension. It starts on my left hip and ends kind of in the middle. And the reason I was supposedly hit on the top of the hands here is not because my crossguard wasn't in a position to defend me from the side, but because my hands had started so low that when my opponent's cut came in, it managed to get over the top of my crossguard and hit my hands before I had reached my full extension. Now, if you watch my previous video, you'll know I talked a lot about a particular fencer in the last video, how they wound their thrust up from that lower position to a much higher position as a method of protecting their hands better. And this is exactly where that kind of thing would have come into play very nicely. See, because my full extension is only at the level of my shoulders, there's this huge amount of time where my hands are spending lower than the level of my shoulders, which means that my horizontal crossguard can't really protect me from these shots over the top. So if I don't get my timing right and I start thrusting a little bit too slow, it's pretty much guaranteed that that thrust coming at me is going to get over the top of my guard and either hit me on the top of the hands or, as we're going to see in a second, stab me directly in the chest. So now we come to this clip where we see really all these problems line up together to create the perfect bad situation for me. I see my opponent gesturing, as they've done before, that they're going to throw a cut from their right side, and I immediately throw the exact same thing. I try to thrust from my left plow directly into the line, taking the center and thrusting them just as I did in the first clip. But none of that happens. Unlike the second clip, it's not because I was short on reach or because my opponent backed up, but in this case, because my opponent threw a flat shield-hau from their starting position that did three crucial things to give them the win. The first is, because their shoulders are more square than mine, they have a little bit of extra reach. Though in this particular case, I actually did a better job with my shoulders, and this probably wasn't the really crucial marker. The second and more crucial marker is that I came up from my low left side to try to meet in the center. And what that means is that there was a period of time from the beginning to about the middle of my technique where my hands were low, and thus as my opponent's sword came into the center line from high to middle, they were able to get over my guard, and just like the second clip where they hit me in the hand, they were able to get over my crossguard and land a thrust to my chest because my rising motion of my crossguard was not able to actually displace it because they were stabbing at the level of my shoulders and they got there way quicker. But the third problem that is also very crucial is the fact that my opponent didn't start in the center line, but entered it with percussive force. Now, theoretically, when I'm starting in my left plow, I'm also not starting in the center line, but my point and my sword is always going towards that center line. The problem is that when you have the center line, one of the only ways to keep it is to make sure that any blade contact is happening in an advantageous bind. But when your opponent comes in, as mine did here, with a percussive cut-like motion, what it does is it crosses the line and slams into them in the center, meaning that whichever sword, in this case mine or my opponent's, had more momentum going to the side is the one that's going to be able to push the other person's sword out of line. My sword was only gingerly shoving its way into the center line from something that was basically the center line already, whereas my opponent slammed into me from the side by swinging from their right sideline to their center. And so it set my tip all the way off to the side and made me miss my thrust. So what you see here is a really great demonstration of why this shield-hau can be so effective against the left plow fencers like myself. But as we're going to see in a minute, why it can also deal with a lot of the other things that I and a lot of other people like to throw from this left plow position as a defense. So now that I'm coming to terms with the fact that I can't fence out of my left plow anymore, I start trying to fence still out of my left plow, but with a little bit more of a cut focus. And what's ironic is that you see me try to repeat exactly what happened to me in the second exchange. You see me try to set up a feinted attack on my right side where I would cut around and throw a hand shot on my left side, which would hit my opponent on the right side of their hand, something that you saw them successfully complete on me just earlier. However, this time, my opponent manages to throw a thrust that their horizontal crossguard successfully protects the right side of their hand, and they make the thrust anyway. Why? And the answer is not because of their shoulders. As you see in this clip, my opponent's shoulders were not nearly as square as they normally were, though that crucial couple inches didn't really hurt them too bad. And it wasn't because they were in thumb grip. Their horizontal crossguard was pretty much the same as mine. It's once again because of the line that they crossed, or in this case, didn't cross. As I've mentioned before, my opponent likes to start off all their exchanges with their sword couched on their shoulder and their thumb on the flat of the blade, and that puts their sword on their right side line outside of the center line. Now, when I cross the line to try to feint on my right and attack on the left, I am effectively attacking my opponent on their right side line, which you might realize is the exact line that they have their sword already in. And what they means is that they can throw a variation of the shield-hau that they just got me with in the previous clip, only instead of crossing the center line and trying to push my blade out of the way, they can simply throw it straight forward. And the irony is that we circle all the way back to the first problem, which is that their shoulders aren't square, and realize that it doesn't even really matter in this case, because the further their right shoulder is forward, the more likely their right arm is going to be at full extension, which means that horizontal crossguard is going to be covering way more of their arm past their arm and their wrist, all the way to the elbow. And it's almost a perfect kind of cycle of all the ways that you can counter somebody who likes to fence from the positions that I do by fencing in the position that my opponent does. And I don't think a lot of people put appreciation on this particular starting position, namely because it's commonly used by people who put their right leg back. But as we've seen here, there actually isn't a existential tie necessary between having your right arm up on your shoulder and having your right leg back. There's definitely some advantages to doing that, but in this particular case, I think I've demonstrated why it can still work and why this right side couch sword position can be so great if you manage to use the shield-haus that my opponent is using here to good effect. As long as you know what your opponent is going to try to do, and you can at the very least guess whether or not they're going to throw a cut offline or throw a thrust in the center line, you can throw almost the exact same move and come out on top. So, this is going to be a little bit of a shorter video, hopefully demonstrating something a little bit more technical that I'm sure no one is going to watch or like. But if you disagree with me and think I'm wrong, feel free to write me an essay in the comments. I've been getting some really long ones lately, and I'll see you next Tuesday.